Namaste, Tashidelek. Good morning to our friends in North America, and good afternoon to our friends in Europe, and good evening to friends in Taiwan and Singapore, and of course, late good evening to our friends in Japan and Australia. So, today we are going to discuss a subject which is very relevant for specifically for today. So today we are going to discuss the declaration of independence of Tibet by the 13th Dalai Lama, because today is the day when the 13th Dalai Lama in 1913 had reiterated the status of Tibet as an independent nation. So that was the time when the Manchu army had invaded Lhasa and created problems. And for 2 years, there was a lot of confusion. And then the Tibetans were able to push out the Manchu army. And that was the time when they were already on the last leg of ruling China. And that was the time when His Holiness Dalai Lama, the 13th Dalai Lama, made the historic declaration of independence of Tibet. So today is the 110th anniversary of that day, of that historic day. And today, I think, is the right day when we should discuss once again uh, Tibet's status as an independent country in history and over what has happened over the years. So we have our friends, experts from who represent various, who will give us various perspectives. So today I will start with a short introduction to the organizers, and then an introduction to our expert speakers, and then we'll leave the floor to our speakers. As you all know, uh, the organizer of this event is the Center for Himalayan Asia Studies and Engagement. This is a think tank which is focused on understanding issues which are related to the Himalayan Asia studies, Himalayan Asia region, and it's a platform for exchange of knowledge, views, and perspectives among Indian and international experts, researchers, writers, and those advocacy groups who take very keen interest on various aspects of political, social, economic, cultural, and strategic developments in this region. Our other organizer is co-organizer is Tibetan Youth Congress, and everybody knows about Tibetan Youth Congress. It doesn't need much introduction, but still, for those members of our audience who are joining us first time, Tibetan Youth Congress is a worldwide organization of the Tibetan diaspora, which has a very brilliant history of 50 years. It stands for the common struggle for Tibetan people for the restoration of complete independence of the whole of Tibet. And over the years, as we know, Tibetan Youth Congress has evolved as the largest and most active, non-violent, and non-governmental organization of the Tibetan diaspora. And it has emerged over the years as a wonderful nursery of nursing talent in social, political, and cultural leadership. And when you see who is who of the Tibetan diaspora, you will surely find that almost all of them, right from the Sikyongs and Kalantripas, ministers, members of parliament, the members of the judiciary, uh, the top diplomats, bureaucrats, writers, social activists, they have been through Tibetan Youth Congress, which molded their personality and their working capacities. So these are two organizations, and we have our today. Now I will introduce our experts. Uh, Let me start with Yudon Aukatsang. Yudon Aukatsang is currently a member of parliament in exile. And until recently, she was the director of Empowering the Vision Project. She is a very active Tibetan woman leader, and she has been active for, I think, about 15 years. and it includes her work with the Tibetan Women's Association and Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy. She has been a product of Delhi University and Jawaharlal Nehru University, and later on she went to USA for her Fletcher to her Tufts. She went to the Tufts University with her Fletcher's school, where she studied international law and diplomacy. So, welcome, Yurunla, to today's discussion. We have Dr. Uwe Mea, who is by profession, he is a medical doctor, and he specializes in neurology. He is passionate Tibet traveler. He has traveled through Tibet very extensively between 1981 and 1991, if I'm not wrong. So he is one of those foreigners who had the chance to be an eyewitness of the atrocities committed on Tibetans and the uprising, and especially in 1988 and 89. So Dr. Uwe is a founding member of the Tibet Initiative Germany, Deutschland. That was done in 1989. And he has been the president of TID from 1991 to 1992. And since 1995, he reallocated himself to Switzerland, uh, where he has worked for many years as the member of board of the GSTF, which is a Swiss Tibetan Friendship Association, and has contributed. The GSTF has made big contributions, and Dr. Uwe Mea personally has made very good contribution towards promoting the cause of Tibet. And currently, he handles tasks related to media and information, and he has relations to international Tibet groups, and he has been in close touch with Swiss Parliamentary Group for Tibet. So, welcome, Dr. Uwe Mea, to today's discussion. We have Tenzin Zochbauer. Tenzin Zochbauer is from Berlin, and she is executive director of Tibet Initiative Deutschland. And she is very well known Tibetan activist, and she has been actively engaged in campaigns which were related to Beijing Olympics 2022. And she was widely quoted because of this campaign. She was widely quoted in German and international media on issues related to human rights in Tibet and in China. And Tenzin is a professional TV media personality, and she has long experience in TV production. And yeah, Tenzin, welcome to today's Galaxy. And now a very special person is our friend Buchung Tsering. Buchung Tsering is one of the best known Tibetan faces in United States these days. And currently he is the interim president of International Campaign for Tibet. He is a veteran in Washington, D.C., who is actively working with ICT to promote the cause of Tibet. And he has worked in very close cooperation with towering personalities like late Lodi Gary and Richard Gere. And right now, he is giving direction to the work they left in between, Lodi Gary left in between. And so before moving to Washington, I knew him as a professional journalist also, and he was working with the CTA, with the DIIR. So that's how we came to know each other. And he's a trained journalist who worked with Indian Express for some time, and then he decided to join the government in exile. So, Buchungla, very, very big welcome to you to today's discussion. And we have Mr. Gompo Dundup with us. He is not only the co-organizer of this webinar and our entire series of webinar, which is going on since April 2020. And we have organized jointly I think, about 26 such international webinars on various aspects of Tibet and, of course, of various aspects of China and all those peoples, those societies who are fighting against Chinese occupation. So Gompala is, as I said, he's the president of Tibetan Youth Congress, one of the best known youth icons today, as we know, and um, uh, he's presiding over Tibetan Youth Congress, which has 45 chapters all over the world, and this organization under his leadership, in addition to promoting the cause of Tibet and the freedom of Tibet, independence of Tibet, is very deeply involved in social work. So there have been, whether there is a calamity or whether this is a huge organization or event like Kala Chakra, you will find Tibetan Youth Congress volunteers and their leader, Gompola, always there. So welcome, Gompola.
Thank you.
So now we start with Buchungla. And as the subject is today, this is 110th anniversary of the declaration by His Holiness 13th Dalai Lama about the independence of Tibet. So we will love to hear from you the Tibetan perspective plus what is happening on the international front on this issue. Buchung Seringla.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you, the organizers, for this opportunity. I wanted to touch on the issue in three ways. First, I would like to talk about what exactly is the declaration and the issues surrounding it. What are the issues raised in it? Second, why is the declaration important? And thirdly, what lessons can we learn from it? I should preface this by saying that I'm not an expert. I'm not a historian. I may be a veteran in the sense that I've worked for some years, been privileged enough to work in the Tibet movement for some years. At best, I may see myself as a political analyst, and so what I say today is based on what my perception of the declaration and the issues surrounding it is. And I would like all of you to look at it from this perspective. So first, what are the issues raised in this declaration? To understand this, we need to understand the historical context. I think, Vijay, you outlined the Chinese part, but also before the Chinese came or invaded Tibet, the British came and invaded Tibet in 1903, 1904. And therefore, His Holiness, the 13th Dalai Lama, had to, in fact, seek refuge in Mongolia and China. And after coming back, it was the other way around. So he had to seek refuge in India. So he had this sort of realization about what the international sort of scenario was. And he realized, I think, that before any international relations can be stabilized, it's important for the Tibetan people themselves to be really together and to work in a united front, if I may say so. The reason why I'm saying this is because I think, although popularly we look at this declaration as the assertion of the independent status of Tibet, but if you look at this declaration in its totality, there are 5 points in it. And the independence part is only the fourth point. The 4 other points relate to, and together with the fifth point, relate to the overall meaning of Tibetan national identity that the 13th Dalai Lama was trying to promote. So, for example, in points 1 and 2 of the declaration, he lays emphasis on the preservation and promotion of Tibetan religion and its philosophy and the study and how people need to be concerned about this survival of the Tibetan religious identity. And he also, in points 3 and 5, he talks about how Tibetan officials should govern the country and there needs to be proper conduct in the socio-economic welfare of the people. uh, uh, important fact there is that it is in this declaration that the 13th Dalai Lama talks about doing away with corporal punishment. He says you cannot cut limbs, you cannot cut also people if you. These are severe methods of punishment that you should no longer do. And the fifth point, that's point number 4, but it's about the independent status of Tibet. And he's making the case from the point that the people need to defend the independent status of Tibet. So this also is the totality of the declaration. If I again may say aside, I think we all who work on Tibet, whether Tibetan or non-Tibetan, should look at all these in totality. And also on this declaration, we need to study the original Tibetan, because I've seen a couple of translations and none of these have the full accurate translation. So therefore, sometimes people sort of misunderstand issues surrounding it based on the translation they've read rather than going to the original. So I wanted to make that point. Point number 4, which is concerned with the independent status of Tibet. I'd like to read that in Tibetan. It says, Pödi Gekab Shenda Tabu Tomjo Tujeta Mideron, Chudu Shider Nebe, Gekab Rawa Demba Shik Intap. Which I translated as Tibet is not endowed with wealth, power, and technology like other nations, yet it is nonetheless a free country abiding in peace and happiness in accordance with the Dharma. And then he goes on to explain about another important part that I'll touch on later on, namely the situation of Tibetans outside of the control of Tibetan government in the East. So that is one thing that is raised in this declaration. So from here, we can see that it's in essence a call by the 13th Dalai Lama to the Tibetan people to understand their political status, social status, and the economic status in the light of the first Chinese Manchu invasion, and then, first the British invasion, and then the Chinese Manchu invasion, and see what we all need to do to sort of prevent any such happenings in the future. His declaration, in fact, is more an plea to the Tibetan people and the Tibetan leaders to be prepared. Therefore, it also has this in mind, in the declaration, bearing in mind the consequences and without confusing between what is to be accepted and abstained from divine and human conduct, all officials should keep this declaration in the records of their offices, abide by it by properly implementing it. So this declaration was sent to all the outlying areas under the Tibetan government's control, and where people were to study it and to sort of implement it. So then comes the second point. What's the importance of this declaration? Why is this declaration significant today? So there, as much as I understand the emphasis on the 1913 declaration, I would urge that we should look at this declaration in conjunction with 2 other subsequent events. One is the 1314 Simla Convention, and the other 1932 Last Testament by the 13th Dalai Lama, because these are all interconnected. If you look at the topics touched and the issues covered. In this declaration, as I mentioned earlier, the 13th Dalai Lama felt that for the Tibetans to regain their past history, their past status, it's important not just for the Tibetans under the Tibetan government's control, but Tibetans outside of the Tibetan government's control in the East, in Kham, which is the term used in the declaration, so that they can be sort of brought under the same Tibetan government's rule. Therefore, at the Simla Convention, the 13th Dalai Lama instructed his official Lönchen Shata to raise the issue of taking back those Tibetan territories in the East. And that was what I think, if you look at historians, they write about mule lots of documents that the Tibetan envoys took, tax documents, etc., to sort of justify the claim over those territories. We know from historians like Thirin Shakela that, in fact, those issues were raised. Eventually, what happened in Shimla was that it only ended up delineating the outer and inner Tibet without all Tibetan area being able to be brought under the control of the Tibetan government. Also, then in 1932, the 13th Dalai Lama, when he was offered a long life offering, in his response to that, he came out with a long statement outlining what he had done, what were the risks, and what should the Tibetan people do. I had the opportunity to translate this many years back, and it's published in the Tibetan Bulletin. The reason why this is important is because in the 1913 declaration, the Dalai Lama talks about why the Tibetan people need to sort of step up to preserve and protect their national identity. And in 1932, he expands this by saying that if you are not careful, communism is already in Mongolia, it will soon be in Tibet, in which it will destroy the Tibetan identity, it will destroy the father and son, the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama. So this testament was a warning by the 13th Dalai Lama to the Tibetan people that unless you really sort of look at the situation of the countries and to step up, we may be faced with grave consequences. What he said, and I quote a bit out of it, it's, in the future, communist system will certainly be forced on this land that cherishes the joint spiritual and temporal system. In fact, that is what happened. We all know now. So he also mentioned in that in the country then, there are people who are more interested in their self-interest. He said that there are people who selfishly seek their own interests, who help their allies, but no one else, who are lazy and but no one else, but who are lazy and untrustworthy. Such people will fail, and it will be evident. They will have regrets that they ought to have behaved better, but it will do no good. And the Dalai Lama said this: as long as I remain, I will take care of Tibet, and it will remain happy and prosperous. This is important. Why? Because of the future that is before us. So what lessons can we learn from this now? That's the third point. First, as I mentioned earlier, this declaration should not be looked at in isolation. It should be looked at together with the Simla Convention outcome and the 1932 last testament by His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama. So if you are going to continue with this annual event, I would suggest to the organizers that you translate all these three documents, compile them together, and then present them so that people can have a very sort of holistic perspective of the political landscape then, and to act accordingly. The second lesson that we can learn from this is that the 13th Dalai Lama was urging the Tibetan people to be mindful of the broader political context and to shoulder their responsibilities. This, I'll come later why this is important for us. While I was trying to sort of prepare for this talk, I came across this question and answer that was there on online, and it's this: the current 14th Dalai Lama, in response to a question, are there any of your predecessors in whom you have a special interest or with whom you have a particular affinity? The 14th Dalai Lama mentions, it's quote, the 13th Dalai Lama, he brought a lot of improvement to the standards of study in the monastic colleges. He gave great encouragement to the real scholars. He made it impossible for people to go up in the religious hierarchy, becoming an abbot and so forth, without being totally qualified. He was very strict in this respect. He also gave tens of thousands of monks ordinations. These were his two main religious achievements. He didn't give many initiations or many lectures. Now, with respect to the country, he had great thought and consideration for statecraft, the outlying districts in particular, how they should be governed, and so forth. He cared very much how to run the government more efficiently. He had great concern about our borders and that type of thing. So this 14th Dalai Lama is also expanding on the two main sort of achievements of the 13th Dalai Lama, namely the national identity protection that he tried to do, including bringing in lost territories and the preservation of and promotion of Tibetan religion and culture. So what should we be doing then in this sort of situation now? There's one that our leadership should be concerned about, and there's other that whether it's Tibetans or friends of Tibet, should be sort of thinking about. And when the 14th Dalai Lama, when he talked about his reincarnation, at a few times he said that a reincarnation comes into existence to fulfill the mission of the predecessor. Therefore, in this instance, for example, the 14th Dalai Lama has been on record saying that he will not be born under current situation in Tibet, or in China, because Tibet under China now is not a congenial atmosphere for this 14th Dalai Lama or his reincarnation to continue his mission. So we have to understand it from that perspective. So coming from it, the 14th Dalai Lama, if you can look at his, we all know about his activities, his now 4 commitments. If you look at all these, you can realize how he's trying to fulfill the mission of his predecessors. His emphasis on monastic reform, including the introduction of scientific education in monasteries to make Tibetan Buddhists be able to compete with modern science. More importantly, on the issue of Tibetan national identity, what the 13th Dalai Lama tried to promote a pan-Tibetan identity became a reality after 1959 under this 14th Dalai Lama. On this matter, Vijay mentioned about Kusur Lodigeri. He's written his memoir. And in his memoir, he says this about this aspect of his holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, about his promoting a creation of a pan-Tibetan identity. This Lodigeri said, this gave a new hope for Tibet's cohesiveness, creating a watershed movement in Tibetan history that has led to true unification in the Tibetan people's heart and mind. Unquote. I urge that each and every one of you who are listening to this, even to read Mr. Lodigeri's book and see what he means by this aspect of the Dalai Lama's initiative. Again, in continuation of the same line, the 14th Dalai Lama has created a path for the Tibetan circle now and for the future through his middle way approach. And he has said that history cannot be changed by anybody, not even by the Dalai Lama. So we have to look at history in its proper context and see that based on that history, what he and the Tibetan leadership are proposing for the future of Tibet is something that's pragmatic, that's reasonable, that's also something that it's a win-win situation both for the Chinese and the Tibetan people. But we have heard him give numerous warnings. I just wanted to sort of quote one warning by this present Dalai Lama, just like the previous Dalai Lama did. In 1976, those of you of a certain generation would recall this statement by His Holiness the Dalai Lama on March 10, 1976. And he said, and I would like to first quote this in Tibetan because that has, it's a short one, and then I'll translate that into English. In that March 10 statement in 1976, he said, "Pimito, rangi togen daonang me the shagne, pimin nangu tikam tongsheki, tenki shepatan chik. Rangi gaje mangzogi dedu la senkur, horde rangi chibu rangu kangdoin chebata ni dada pyo miri chi dedu netan zada kangdachi yeba nguyo musimba jode rawan chen shenda la par kap dedu kido chebata sumni shindu tuzab chewe nosam menden nangu. The March statement had this by His Holiness: "My countrymen, beware of the yawning chasms. Forgetting the enemy who invaded and wrested the country, you indulge in squabbles and factionalism. Discarding the thoughts and motives to promote the interests of the larger masses of one's own people, you seek and work to promote your own interests only. Discarding the thoughts and motives to promote the interests of the largest mass. I'm sorry, this is a repetition. Refusing to recognize the grave economic situation that the Tibetan people are in, you desire and emulate luxury lifestyle of other rich people. These are unhealthy trends and matters of serious concern. So give a thought to these seriously." This warning is still applicable today in our present situation. So His Holiness has said that even as we struggle for the future of Tibet based on middle way approach, we should have no qualms in asserting the historical independence of Tibet. And I look at this today's event as one way of sort of helping to promote that. So what can we, those who are working for Tibet, do in this situation? There's one way we can help is by seeing that we failed in the before 1959, we meaning the broader Tibetan people, failed in bringing the international community in support of this independent status of Tibet historically. So today we can work to see that in our respective countries where we work, those governments can take steps to recognize this historical status. It's only then they'll understand the sacrifice and they'll understand the concession that the middle way is all about. In our case, in the United States, in consultation with the Tibetan leadership and with the supporters of Tibet in the Congress, we have tried to make sure that the historical status can continue to be supported and strengthened to the best possible existence. And right now we have a legislation in Congress called the Promoting a Resolution to the Tibet-China Act. This basically sums up the two things: the historical separateness of Tibet, independent status of Tibet being the basis on which we can nullify the Chinese claim that Tibet had been part of China since time immemorial, since antiquity. At the same time, say that the Chinese lack legitimacy in its present control of Tibet, and the only way they can gain legitimacy, if at all, is through resolving the issue of Tibet in negotiations with envoys of His Holiness the Dalai Lama or their representatives. Therefore, I believe, in conclusion, there are two things that we can do. First is the task before us is to see that not to do what our previous generation did when the 13th Dalai Lama made his call to the people to shoulder their responsibility. That is that we should all, whether it's in the leadership in Dharamsala or citizens or Tibet supporters, take up our respective role in the way that it can promote the common interests of the Tibetan people. Secondly, I think we should not shy away from discussing any issue on which we may or may not agree with. It's important for all of us to realize that we are functioning in a democracy, and in a democracy there will be disagreement. But these disagreements have to be put in a proper context so that they don't create misgiving, they don't create misunderstanding, so that we Tibetans and Tibet supporters can spend all our time and energy in confronting the challenges that's outside and not waste time trying to sort of create some sort of issue within ourselves. And that is, these are the two things, if at all, we can take lesson from the 1913 declaration and the subsequent. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Bhujungla. You have prepared a ground for all others, not only our other speakers, but for those people who are engaged in carrying forward the issue of Tibet at different levels. So I'm thankful to you that you have given the right perspective to the declaration of 13th Dalai Lama, and the way you have connected it to the Shimla Agreement in 1913 and the 13th Dalai Lama's declaration in 1932. Uh, this, I must admit, it has given me, I have been associated with cause of Tibet now 50 years, but it has given me also a very new way of looking at 1913 declaration. And I'm sure my other Tibetan friends will also do. And not only this discussion, but in future, whenever they deal with this issue, the way you have analyzed, I'm sure this is going to help. Thank you very much, Bujung Seringla. And now, may I request our friend Dr. Uwe Mea, who is an old friend of Tibet, who has very good, as I explained earlier, who has very good knowledge of Tibet. He has been a very frequent traveler to Tibet, and now he is engaged in promoting the cause of Tibet. Dr. Uwe Mea, please.
Well, thank you, Vijay. You made me aware, and I noticed that I'm almost the only non-Tibetan speaker, so I counted you as Tibetan already. So I said, what can I do to contribute? And it will be very much from an outside perspective, and that is about perceptions in media, politics, and the general public. So first of all, we all know the recent groundbreaking book of Michael Wolfgang Prague about Tibetan independence. And I need not repeat here what he can say in much more competent words. So by the way, we are issuing his book here in German language, so that will soon be available in Austria, Switzerland, and in Germany. But back to perception. So first of all, what I wanted to say is that in the general public, it is not clear what Tibet we speak of. So for many in the general public, Tibet is just a region somewhere in the Himalayas. So I'm exaggerating a little bit. It's characterized by snow-capped mountains. There are some associations on Shangri-La, Buddhism, and monks, and probably also on His Holiness the Dalai Lama. But it's very much a perception of a region and not of a country that a decade ago was de facto independent, and not of a country that is under Chinese occupation now. So there may be some notions of some kind of suppression in Tibet, but very often it's not much more. So when I give lectures on Tibet, which I do from time to time, the first thing that I usually say is that it is probably not the same Tibet, what we refer to. So Tibet is very much referred to as the so-called Tibetan Autonomous Region. And then when I show the historic map of the de facto independent Tibet with 3 provinces, and then a map of the current Tibet, which is just a fragment of it, there's quite surprise in the audience. So even worse, when I read media here, they are implicitly adopting the Chinese language when they report on Tibet, and they just call it a region in the southwest of China. So that makes them unaware that with this, they implicitly and unknowingly not acknowledge that Tibet has always been a part of China. When we move to politics, we notice that the Swiss federal government and with it many other governments in the Western world do not challenge China's one China standpoint. And thereby they fall into the trap of accepting Tibet as a matter of Chinese internal affairs, and thereby weakening the Tibetan position in negotiations. Also, Michael Wolfgang Prague points out that Beijing is often using these statements as evidence for its claim, and using the international community statements as a substitute for legitimacy over Tibet. The other trap that I notice in the Western world, politicians, media, the public make is falling into the trap of calling Tibetans a minority and using euphemisms such as the Tibet issue. So Tibetans, to remind ourselves, were made a minority only by Chinese occupation. In 1950, Switzerland was among the first countries in the Western world to establish diplomatic relations with a new communist government. And they signed a free trade agreement with China as early as 2014. 2 years ago, the Swiss federal government issued a document called China Strategy 2021 to 2024. And when you read it, it's very interesting that in the preface and executive summary, the first paragraph mentions economic aspects. China is the third most important partner in foreign trade for Switzerland after the US and Europe. And only in the second paragraph, Swiss government mentions Swiss interests also include values, and these include democracy, the rule of law, and human rights, but they come second after economic relations. In its strategy, the government emphasized several times its desire to what they call build bridges between the conflicting parties, to stick to a dialogue and to the principle of human rights. And also the free trade agreement contains a clause on respecting human rights, but that is a very soft statement. And there are no instruments how violations would be addressed or sanctions be imposed. And even these soft and very indifferent statements, China reacts very harshly, so it harvested quite harsh criticism of the Swiss ambassador in Switzerland. And we also notice now that the human rights dialogue with China has been suspended for several years, and there are no clear plans to resume it. In the past, when His Holiness was visiting Switzerland, we demanded several times that he be officially received by a member of the Swiss federal government. We launched a petition that was signed by several thousand people when he was last here in 2017. But we heard that unfortunately all calendars of the members of the Swiss federal government were full with other appointments. And if they mention him, he's very often and suspiciously emphasized as a religious leader. There's no mention of his past role as a temporal leader. That is very much avoided. And the same happened with Pempa Tsering when he visited Switzerland over a year ago. It's like a reflex that any mention of the government in exile or central Tibetan administration is accompanied by adding that this is not recognized by any government in the world, and that invalidates its unique role as a democratic government that could also serve as a template for future democracy in Tibet. So what can we do from outside here to improve the situation? So first of all, it is education of the general public, of the media about the de facto independence of Tibet, and to clarify that when we speak of Tibet, we should speak of Tibet in its historical confines with its 3 provinces. Second is we should educate on wording to avoid naming Tibet just a region in the southwest of China and of calling Tibetans a minority. And lastly, it is continued pressure on politicians to be more assertive and that more topics than just human rights belong on the agenda. And these are the topics, again, of illegal occupation and respect of international law. So let me finish with that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Uwe, and especially the way you have handled the issue of the Chinese narrative, how it has to be handled. I think this is, you have pointed out at a very important issue, which makes today's discussion quite significant. Because one major problem on the Tibetan issue is that the whole world is practically eating out of hands of China. It's borrowing the Chinese narrative. It's the way I have seen it so many times, the way newspapers or many people, when they are introducing His Holiness Dalai Lama from the same platform, they introduce him as religious leader, and not forgetting that he was the ruler of of Tibet. And the issue like presenting Tibetans as a minority or referring to only Tar as Tibet, this is narrative, the Chinese narrative, which they have been able to implant in the minds of world community very successfully. And this is a poison which has to be handled very effectively and consistently. And you spoke of the book. Thank you very much for talking about this book, Michael van Waal's book, 2020. I think what you are doing, that translating, you have translated, your group has translated it into German, and you are publishing it. It's something very significant. And here in India, we are also thinking seriously that this book should be published in Hindi, because people understand this language much easily. And India is a country which must understand the real narrative of China, and this book blasts that narrative into pieces and very effectively. So I'm very happy that number one, a colleague like Michael van Walt came out with this book, and secondly, that we are recognizing the importance of this book. So, of course, this book is not the issue of today's discussion, but it relates to the basic spirit of today's discussion. Thank you very much. And now, may I request Yudon Aukatsang, who, as I explained, a very useful leader of Tibet, member of parliament. Yudon Aukatsang, we would love to have your perspective.
Tashidelek, Vijay Krantiji, Kumpala, and speakers on the panel, and to all the viewers. I'm really honored to be sharing this platform today with all the fellow panelists who have been working really hard for the cause of Tibet and Tibetans. And I'm also really pleased to learn from them. I'm neither a scholar nor a historian, but a member of Tibetan Parliament in exile, who's sharing her thoughts in celebration of this very significant day. I actually wrote a piece today in the Times of India blog, which I have a small blog, and I thought I'll share, my thoughts from this blog also in this session. Today really is the 110th anniversary of the proclamation of the independence by the 13th Dalai Lama. This proclamation followed the fall of the Qing dynasty. I know I'm repeating this because it's very important to reiterate this. Pujuna has done this, but I think it's very important that we start with that. And it's very important to also emphasize that the Qing dynasty, who were Manchus and not Chinese rulers, had Tibet was a protectorate state under the Manchu rulers, which means the Manchu rulers did not possess sovereignty over Tibet, but was responsible for defense and external relations. This is very similar to many former protectorate states under British rule, and somewhat close to current relationship that Bhutan and India also enjoys. Tibet has always enjoyed a distinct geography, population, and a unique language and culture. From 1913 to 1950, we are talking about soon after the proclamation of the 13th Dalai Lama, Tibet ruled without any foreign influence or interference and had its own Tibetan army, Foreign Affairs Bureau, issued passports, and even trade missions were sent in 1948 to several countries, including India, China, US, UK, Italy, Ireland, Saudi Arabia, and Switzerland, after securing visas. Tibet was invaded and colonized for the first time by the People's Liberation Army under the Communist China, the present Chinese regime. Barely months after seizing power in China, actually sent PLA to occupy Tibet. At the time, Tibet was independent but largely isolated from the rest of the world. The world was really caught up in Cold War geopolitics, and the Korean crisis was in full swing. The communist China came in the guise of, quote unquote, liberating us from old feudal system and imperialism. And some Tibetans, unfortunately, fell for those shrewd propaganda and even cooperated with the PRC. In the words of late Professor Dawa Norbu, who I also had the good fortune of being a student while I was in JNU, he says, I quote, Chinese strategies for taking over Tibet included co-opting the ruling class, presenting themselves as modernizers rather than Marxist revolutionaries, and doling out generous payments in silver dollars to rich and poor alike. So the 14th Dalai Lama was quickly enthroned to take on the political reign while this was going on at the tender age of 15 on November 17, 1950. So 6 months later, on May 23rd, 1951, we all know the infamous, the so-called, quote unquote, 17-point agreement of the Central People's Government and the local government of Tibet on measures for peaceful liberation of Tibet, quote unquote finished, was forced onto us with PLA stationed in Chamdo, threatening further encroachment. They did not even stick to their coerced promises of maintaining existing structures in Tibet, and soon Tibetans started revolting. The revolt actually started from Kham and it spread to the Tibetan capital, Lhasa. Mass uprisings took place on March 10th and 12th, 1959, as we all know about it. Many of our parents also fought the Chinese under the Chushigandruk Tibetan National Voluntary Army. Chinese army shelled all the Tibetan areas, brutally crushed the revolutionaries with a bombardment of artillery shells, killed many thousands of Tibetans, and arrested and imprisoned many, many more. His Holiness the Dalai Lama was forced to escape on March 17th. And after many, many days of trekking across rough terrains, he reached India on 30th March, followed by over 80,000 Tibetans and many more in the years to come. When Tibetans were going through all these problems and all this crisis with China, the United Nations General Assembly in 1959, in 1960, in 1961 passed resolutions, which actually stated that the Tibetan people have the right to self-determination. The International Commission of Jurists in 1960 determined that genocide had been committed by China against Tibet. They actually quoted 4 principal facts which established evidence in relation to genocide. A, that China will not permit practice of Buddhism in Tibet. B, that they have systematically set out to eradicate this religious belief in Tibet. C, that in pursuit of this design, they have killed religious figures because their religious belief and practice was an encouragement and example to others. And D, very interestingly, that they have forcibly transferred large numbers of Tibetan children to a Chinese materialist environment in order to prevent them from having a Tibetan upbringing. All this are very familiar to us because, in fact, the situation in Tibet today is even more critical. Tibetans are not free to assemble and celebrate religious festivals or receive teachings from their revered lamas. Pictures of His Holiness the Dalai Lama are not allowed in the homes. Check on numbers and activities of monks and nuns continue to happen in religious institutions. Arrest and imprisonment of prominent figures and activists continue. Colonial boarding schools uprooting young Tibetan children from their language, culture, and identity are going on. At least 157 Tibetans have self-immolated in protest against gross violations of their fundamental freedoms and destruction of Tibetan identity and way of life. And also the recent discovery of ongoing mass DNA testing of Tibetans used in ethnic coding for database and easy tracking of Tibetans who are politically active. All of the above actually make a strong case to prove acts of genocide committed by the Chinese Communist regime in Tibet. So while we struggled against the brutal Chinese authorities and advocated for Tibetan freedom for the last 63 years, we almost took it for granted that Tibet was historically never a part of China. This fact was not properly amplified in our official documents. Our leadership has now begun to proactively counter Chinese narrative of Tibet with a report, which started with a report entitled, Tibet was never a part of China, but the middle way approach remains a viable solution. This emphasis is especially important as China is continuously lobbying for non-interference on the issue of Tibet based on the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Without reiteration of Tibet as an occupied country, there are no grounds for pursuing dialogue for peaceful resolution based on middle way approach. On a recent official Tibetan parliamentary delegation to 4 European countries supported by ICT Europe, we were successful in meeting with many parliamentarians, government officials, and civil society groups. We began on a high note in Czech Republic with a one-day conference at the Czech Senate on what Czech Republic and the EU can do to address the crises in Tibet. The conference was hosted by the vice presidents of the Czech Senate under the aegis of Czech EU presidency in partnership with Czechs to Support Tibet, Synopsis, European Values Center for Security Policy, and ICT Europe. The vice presidents and the deputy ministers of foreign affairs of Czech Republic made some strong statements in support of Tibet. In Lithuania, too, we were able to hold meetings and address a joint press conference with Friends of Tibet in the parliament, in the Lithuanian parliament, also called the SEIMAS. Our meetings with officials in Sweden and Netherlands were also very good, but it demonstrated a relatively more cautious approach. During this visit, our main ask was really to urge European leaders to refrain from accepting the Chinese narrative of Tibet being historically a part of China. Make PRC leadership accountable to uphold international law and treat Tibet as a matter of international concern, not China's internal affair. Denounce China's interference in the reincarnation of high religious lamas, and more particularly the Dalai Lama. Support early resumption of dialogue for peaceful resolution of Tibet issue with the representatives of His Holiness and the Chinese government. We pointed out that except for the coerced so-called 17-point agreement for peaceful liberation of Tibet, China does not have a shred of document or evidence to legitimize its rule over Tibet. Our gift to the political leaders and the government officials was a framed picture of Shegapa's passport, Shegapa, who's the former Tibetan finance minister, and his visas to India, USA, UK, Italy, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Switzerland, under the Tibetan Trade Delegation in 1948, which clearly validates Tibet as a country. So we all know that under the current geopolitics, China, under Xi Jinping, has tightened the party's grip over the people it rules by stricter censorship and surveillance, and has also adopted a more dominating and aggressive foreign policy infused with Chinese nationalism and Marxist-Leninist ideology. Evidences are coming out of surveillance beyond borders, transnational surveillance, we call them, in many countries, with the secret overseas police stations that were reported by Safeguard Defenders and Chinese spy balloon shoot-downs in the US recently. China is on a path to aggressively pursue an establishment of a new global order where China dictates the terms and rules of engagement, posing a direct challenge to the liberal international order based on democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. Despite all this dismal current geopolitics, I would like to conclude with hope. For me, this month in February has been very interesting. And there were two positive developments vis-a-vis Tibet. The first one was the reintroduction of the bipartisan and bicameral Tibet bill. It's called Promoting a Resolution to Tibet-China Conflict Act, which proposes that the US make it a policy to protect the Tibetan people's right to self-determination under international law, and states that the legal status of Tibet remains to be determined in accordance with international law, which means the Tibetan status is not being determined legally. So this is a very important development, and I hope and pray that this bill becomes an act and it's passed in both the houses. And I think we have a lot of hope that this will happen. The second development really is the UN press release, in which 3 independent UN human rights experts have raised the alarm on the policy of forced assimilation of the Tibetan identity into the dominant Han Chinese majority through the mandatory residential school system, which has affected 1 million Tibetan children. So these two are very positive developments, and I would like to conclude on that. And I also agree with Vijay that Michael Van Wall's book, Tibet 2020, I think it's very important that we, get a hold of that, because he was also there to present at the Czech Senate at the one-day conference where same issues were raised, that how important it is to counter the Chinese narrative, and that the Tibet conflict and the Tibet status still remains unresolved, and it's very important to resolve that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yunonla. You have presented the Tibetan perspective in a very effective way. And the points which I really loved, the way you explained, that one very simple thing people should know in the world, that number one, the Qing dynasty or the Manchus were not Tibetan, were not Chinese. So there is no question of China's dominance or occupation or rule over Tibet. That's something which I like. And you gave a very good example of a relation between the Manchus and Tibet, as the relation as we see between India and Bhutan. So in this relation, it should be easy to understand. India and Bhutan are very good friends, but they are very different countries. They have the relation same, as friendly and almost like a family as the Manchus had with Tibet. So this point has to be, I think, explained, and you gave a very good example. I appreciate it, and it gives people like me also new ideas. I'm going to use it. Your authorship, but I'll use this. Thank you very much, and of course, the way you have explained how the word of Tibet is being spread across to different parliaments, and now the way it is picking up, it has started with America, and let us hope very soon the European Parliament should also do something about it. So thank you very much. And now we have, the voice from a very active voice from Europe, the Tibetan voice. We have Tenzin Dzogchen, who has been active on especially promoting the cause of Tibet in Europe through Tibet Initiative Deutschland. And as I told you, she is active in Berlin. So from Berlin, we have another perspective. Please, Tenzila.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vijayla, for the invitation to this talk. And thanks a lot to all the previous speakers who have already covered so much of this very important topic of today in great detail. And we already got some important advices on what we have to pay attention on and what we can learn from the past, but also what we need to do in future to secure the future of Tibet. So I would like to add a little bit and present probably more the view of the international Tibetan support groups and movements for Tibet, because the day of the 13th February, it's an important day for support groups, because it is a day where all over the world there will be actions to remember. And we will see today many Tibetan flags and pictures of his 13th of Dalai Lama and the declaration on the internet. Probably there will be demonstrations and virtual around the world, and Tibetans and supporters try to remember and as well to celebrate this Tibetan holiday. But unfortunately, there is not much to celebrate because we don't have independence. And sadly, as we already heard, the situation in Tibet is worsening. The information we receive about the human rights situation in Tibet is horrifying, and it does not allow us to celebrate. It is much more important to use this day to raise awareness and to make sure that no one forgets the history of Tibet. And I feel like we need to make this emotionally accessible, because the destiny of Tibet affects us all. And it would be also a great loss for the whole world if the CCP succeeds with its strategy to erase the Tibetan identity. And that's why we need to mark this day and to remember the Tibetan proclamation of independence from China or the Manchus. And we have to draw attention, to the history. It is difficult to counter this very dominant propaganda from the CCP, but we need to try this. And I think support organizations play an important role in this strategy. So we need to clearly point out that the illegal occupation of Tibet was happening, and that before that, Tibet was never a part of China. And therefore, we do have the right to demand freedom, self-determination, and even independence. And I remember in my teenage years, thanks for my mother, I saw how heavily this issue was discussed in the Tibetan community. And I also realized how much it made me feel insecure about my position, not being well enough educated about the history of Tibet, because it wasn't clear to me as well. So the fact that the Central Tibetan Administration is right now focusing on bringing the Tibetan history to the forefront, I think is a very significant step. And for me, I think it should not only focus on the Western communities and politicians who are going to be educated more about our history. We really have to focus on the young Tibetans who live in exile, and we have to pick them up in a way they understand and they can be proud of their history. Because if we are not confident in our own history, how can we convince others? And unfortunately, this is a very common situation, that countries who has been colonized, their history is going to be erased. And that's why I think I think Tibetans have done a very good job in the past, with writing down all the witnesses, trying to secure the past so that the history is not forgotten. And yeah, so for myself, I noticed, especially here in Germany, again, that young Tibetans, many of them know little about our history before the occupation of Tibet. And most of them probably get the information online from Google, Wikipedia, and also social networks. And that's why I think it's particularly important to digitalize our information and make it accessible in an easy way to as many people as possible. So we need to spread this information. And I think, as it was already mentioned, books like Brief 2020, Tibet Brief 2020 from Michael van Wald, but also Dr. Uwe Meyer, he wrote a book in German, Focus Tibet. These are very important works which are up to date and we can reference on it. So yeah, as I already said, I realize sometimes it's also difficult for us in the work as support groups to find informations and also as well witnesses, Tibetan witnesses about the situation, because yeah, the violence against Tibetan is going on since decades, and CCP has been specialized in silencing Tibetan voices. And the little informations we receive from Tibet, they can give us a little hint about the reality, but probably, or we can all be very sure if we trust what we hear and see, just the small information we get, that the situation is frightening, and that Tibet should get a bigger platform on international political level. One point I would like to raise is the implementation of Tibet houses, which I think is a great idea to preserve the Tibetan culture and identity. And nowadays we have already in many countries Tibet houses, in Germany as well. And I would like to encourage Tibetans as well to engage much more with Tibet houses, the Tibetan diaspora, that that these institutions get better known in the countries, but also maintained for the future. Because in contrast to these Tibet houses, we have these Confucius institutions, which are like a propaganda system from the CCP. And in Germany, we have 19 Confucius Institutes, which are all implemented, or many of them are implemented with at the universities. And they try very hard to spread the history of China from the CCP point of view. So a date like 13th February 1913 will never appear in the lessons from Confucius Institute. And I think this is a very critical situation, because in this way they are rewriting the history of Tibet and also other occupied areas in China, and they spread their view from the CCP and propaganda to a large scale of people. So yeah, that's why I think this is one action campaign many support groups are actually focusing on. And in Germany especially, we are more focused on the 10th March, and we celebrate the Tibetan flag on that day. We encourage cities and towns across Germany to raise the flag on 10th March. And with this involves a lot of educational work, where we also inform them about the history of Tibet. And I'm very happy that now for over 25 years, the flag campaign is very successful. And last year we had over 450 cities who raised the flag in public. And I hope that this science goes beyond the borders of the Himalaya and show the solidarity to our to the Tibetans inside Tibet, and give them confidence and strength and hope as well, as we already heard, because that's what we need. And I would like to end with just a small why I think the Tibetan flag is a very important sign. It was also implemented during that time of the 13th Dalai Lama. And I think it's much more than just a symbol of a country. Then the Tibetan flag, it symbolized the struggle for freedom, for human rights and self-determination. It reminds us on a time when Tibet was an independent and free country, and the Tibetan flag is a proof of the illegal occupation by the People Liberation Army. It is nowadays still a symbol of resistance inside Tibet, because until now the flag is banned inside Tibet, and Tibetans are being arrested or punished if they own a flag or distribute it online. But overall, I would say the Tibetan flag is a sign and symbol of hope, which reminds us that we all hope to see the Tibetan flag one day flying on the roof of the Potala and the capital city of Lhasa, and knowing that His Holiness the Dalai Lama has managed to return home. And that's why I think it's so important to preserve our culture and history and uphold the Tibetan flag with a lot of proud and by being proud on our identity. So I look forward for more questions and probably a deeper talk into the topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tanzila. The points you raised, a few points which are really significant and have to be underlined on a day like 13th February. The way you spoke about the Tibetan new generation, their education. I think one can't agree more than what you have said, or that today there is a need for education of the Tibetan generation, which unfortunately I find they have very good determination, no doubt, about the struggle of Tibet. But when it comes to knowing historic facts, when it comes to fighting back or pushing back the Chinese narrative and Chinese propaganda, unfortunately, friends like me find that a good section of Tibetan uh, generation, young generation especially, they have determination, but they don't have much information. As you said, they they rely more on Wikipedia, and without realizing that even all these, I would call it institution like Wikipedia, are spreading China's narrative. And the issue you raised about Confucius institutes, I think this is a very serious issue, which Tibet support groups like TID and other groups have to take forward very strongly. So I agree with you very much, and I'm sure we all of us share on this day your dream that we will see the flag of free Tibet on Potala, and His Holiness Dalai Lama uh, returning back to a free Tibet. Thank you very much for underlining this goal once again. Thank you very much. And now I would love to invite Gompola to please present his perspective before we go for a some question answer session. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
Tashida,
Gompola.
greetings to all. So, this is a very important day, historical day to observe, as many of our previous panelists have highlighted the importance of Tibet Independence Day and the significance of day. And the Puchungla have already touched with the historical facts, and Yudrenla have highlighted the today's geopolitical issue and the importance of Tibet independent with the discourse of the Central Tibet Administration official policy. And our friends of Tibet, Ube Mia, have, as a Friends of Tibet, highlight the importance of Tibet issue in international discourse. And the young activist Tenzin has highlighted her own experience as a young Tibetan activist. So we, the Tibetan Youth Congress, consider this day, Independence Day, as a historical important day to observe. The Central Executive Committee, with the very core meaning, we organized this a webinar jointly with the CHES. As the previous panelists have highlighted, we have all the proof to be an independent state. It's declared that the Chinese illegal occupied Tibet, and these days, with the Chinese influence, with their propaganda mechanism, try to change international discourse. So we, the Tibetan activists and Tibetan organization, all the Tibetan masses has a responsibility to counter that, to make China accountable, to be the voice of innocent voiceless Tibetan people who ever dreamed of free and independent Tibet. So we always say that the Tibetan and Tibetan Youth Congress struggle for the complete independence is not just for the Tibetan people. So it's a Tibetan issue, is an international issue. Our independence is directly linked with the security of India. Our independence is directly linked with the global harmony and the global environment and the ecological system. So the Tibetan struggle for the complete independence is not just a Tibetan call. Is it not just for the cause of Tibet and Tibetan people? Is an international call. So we need the support and the attention from all the global communities, and we are grateful for all the friends of Tibet for a very long term. For a very long time they are supporting our call, and we are making our best possible way to achieve our ultimate aim of restoring the complete independence of Tibet. And secondly, for the Tibetan youth, it's a very important to reclaim our past. Our past is that Tibet was an independent country. So China illegal occupied our nation. Now this is our responsibility to safeguard our nation, to bring back our country, and with the full josh, we have to organize different events, we have to actively engage in a different political activism work to make our dream come true. So, being a young Tibetan born in exile, our parents and our society always taught us that there is a big R on our forehead, and that first R stands for the refugee. With the Chinese illegal occupation of Tibet in 1959, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and many Tibetans were forced to take refuge in the foreign countries, and that R stands for refugee, and the second R stands for Rangzen. The Rangsen is the struggle that is continuously carried out by the Tibetan generations. So we, the Tibetan youth, have to continuously do all our possible way to achieve the Rangzin, which stand for the second R, and third one is the resistance. So Tibetan for more than 6 decades continuously resisting against the Chinese atrocities, Chinese illegal occupation of Tibet, and that resistance not only specify in the foreign country, but Tibetan brothers and sisters inside Tibet had made the supreme sacrifices to achieve this goal. So this is the joint resistance by the Tibetan, both the Tibetan inside and outside Tibet. And this is the collaboration and the solidarity and the support that we receive from all the friends of Tibet globally. And with this, our day will come soon. So we, the Tibetan Youth Congress, consider 13th Feb an important historical day to observe. So Tibetan Youth Congress regional chapter across the globe observe this day with the different means. Some of our chapter organize a political rally, protest campaign, and some have organized a virtual conference like this in the different cities and the town across the globe. So this is the kind of brief statement that I want to give
Okay.
before we conclude with the Thanksgiving remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Gompala, for this the TYC perspective, especially the way TYC is active in promoting the cause of Tibet, and the way you explained that it is not only the independence and freedom of Tibet which is significant, because once Tibet is independent, then it will ensure peace for the neighbors, especially for India. And of course, it is going to make a big contribution to the world peace. So thank you very much for underlining this point. And now I think maybe we have another way of concluding this discussion. If I may request all panelists, because they have made their presentations and they have listened to other panelists. So if I request you all to make your own concluding remark, that will be enriching this discussion. So with whom I would love to, I should start. May I request Buchungla to please give your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Vijay. It's good to hear the different perspectives on the issue. I think there are many common elements on this issue that came up in today's discussion, and again, I wanted to reiterate 2 points that I've tried to make in my presentation. First is that in 1913, the 13th Dalai Lama made his statement, given the political landscape then and the need of the people to step up and do their might. And the people failed. Now we have another opportunity when, during the time of the 14th Dalai Lama, we Tibetans and Tibet supporters need to step up and work towards fulfilling the objectives for the Tibetan people. While in 1913, Tibet was independent, the Tibetan people had that power in their hand. 2023, Tibet is under Chinese occupation, but we have a broader platform than people of 1913. What the 13th Dalai Lama lacked in international outreach, we have that opportunity. And so we have to make the best possible use of it and sort of to create a sort of positive outcome. Thank you very much.
Oh, yes. I think, the way you have explained it. Thank you very much. And now I would request Yudon La. And later I would request Dr. Uwe to give the final his comment. And first Yudon La and then Tenzin La, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very much.
I would like to resonate with Pujula. I think we are currently in a geopolitical kind of world, which is kind of favorable. When I was in Europe on this 4-country tour, I felt that the climate was global climate unfortunately, with the Ukraine war and China getting more and more aggressive, is actually more favorable to us. And so we have a great opportunity here, and we need to be more united in our common purpose. We shouldn't get bogged down with all the little petty stuff that is going on around us. We must cancel out all the small things that are catching our attention and wasting our time, and really focus and work together. It's very, very important that. And most importantly, like we said, since today is the day when the 13th Dalai Lama proclaimed independence of Tibet in 1913, I think we must make it very clear that no country buys into this Chinese narrative of Tibet being historically a part of China. That we should make very clear. And as a Tibetan parliament member, we have unanimously supported the middle way approach. And until that is there, we are going to be working on a viable solution, but based on the historical fact that Tibet has never been a part of China and is an occupied country. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Tenzin.
Thank you very much. Yeah, as I already said, I have already learned a lot, and I think this is what we should continue. And I think these webinars are very helpful in this case. We have to share our opinion, we have to discuss together, and give also a variety of point of views, especially, as I said, for young people. I think it's so important that they can choose by themselves what they want to, how they want to stand up for Tibet, because there are so many different ways we can do this. And I hope we can be an inspiration on this. I personally, I've seen that a lot of the supporters we have in our organizations are people who have traveled to Tibet in the 80s or 90s. And when they came back and saw the situation with their own eyes inside Tibet, they decided to work for Tibet since decades and to stand up for the Tibetans inside Tibet. So nowadays it is hardly impossible to go inside Tibet, and a lot of Tibetans are born in exile and have not had the opportunity to see their own home country. And that's why, I think it's so important that we engage with the people who have seen Tibet, but also we have to secure the past and make sure that we work for the future together. Thank you.
Thank you, Tenzin. And now we have the last word from Dr. Uwe Mea. Before I request Gompola for the word of the vote of thanks. Dr. Uwe Mea, please.
Yeah, it's a great honor for me to have the real final word, and I can just echo what Tenzin said. Is a big thank you to you, Vijay, because I learned a lot too. And I think the value and importance of this webinar today is really that we looked at Tibet independence from almost every possible angle. So it was more than just repeating textbooks on international law. And thank you to you, Buchongla, to really highlight what is behind the Declaration of Independence. So it was much more than just a piece of paper and paragraphs. I agree with Tenzin. The situation is changing. So here in Switzerland, there is coming a more critical view on China, a more critical view on the Belt and Road Initiative. And we have to use that opportunity to really highlight more about Tibet and its independence. So thank you for everyone to educate ourselves, and myself particularly.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Uwe. And now we come to the concluding part, that is the vote of thanks. I'll request Gompola to please give vote of thanks.
Yes, so I, on behalf of Tibetan Youth Congress and Center for Himalaya Asia Studies and Engagement, CHASE, would like to thank all our panelists. First, our Member of Parliament, Yudunla, for accepting our invitation and joining all the way from Singapore. So thank you very much for your presence. And this is not your first time. Earlier also, you have accepted and you make your presence in this important webinar. Thank you very much. And second, Puchung Sringla. And if I add one more additional introduction to Puchungla's brief introduction by the Vijay Kranti ji. And Bujungla was the former executive member of Tibetan Youth Congress, and still he strongly support Tibetan Youth Congress, and he advocate and he advised us to do the advocacy and different work. Especially, we had a good interaction during TYC 50th founding anniversary celebration in Washington, D.C. last year. So, Pujungla, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and making your presence and giving your insightful knowledge and information about this His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama proclamation or declaration of Tibet independence. Thank you very much, Pujungla. And I also want to thank Dr. Ube Mia for your towering support of be a voice of Tibetan in Switzerland and being your leadership and strong support in Germany. So thank you very much for your presence in this important webinar. So Dola, thank you for your support and thanks for your presence and accepting our invitations. And I also want to thank young Tibetan activists from Germany, Denzin Zojbela. Thank you very much. And we are looking forward for more young activists like you from across being a responsible Tibetan, a young Tibetan working for the cause of Tibet. And thank you very much for your presence, sharing your thought in this important platform. And I also want to thank Vijay Kranti ji. So there is no words to thank you. So for your for more than 5 decades support for the Tibet, and we are consider you as Tibetan like us. So for the Tibetan Youth Congress, you are very dear friend of Tibetan Youth Congress. For time and again, you guide us. Time and again, you show your solidarity and support. So thank you very much for being as a co-organizer, for being as a moderator, for being as the bulldozer, a man guidance behind this successful event. And this is our 26th episode. We are looking forward for more kind of this kind of interesting, useful webinars in coming days. So Vijay Ganti ji, on behalf of Tibetan Youth Congress, I want to I sincerely and deeply thank for your active contribution. And I also want to thank Lobsang Setanla from Tibetan Action Institute for his continuous technical
Yes.
support. So this whole virtual program is successful with his technical kind of knowledge and his technical support. So Losatela and the team from Tibet Action, I want to thank on behalf of both the organization, and also I want to thank all the virtual participants. So today we got a good number of participants. Many have kept their command also, and this we are keeping its record in Tibetan Youth Congress Facebook page and Vijay Kranti ji YouTube page. So any interested, either is a researcher, student, or a supporter, or the individual who want to listen this, they can directly follow Tibetan Youth Congress Facebook page and Vijay Kranti ji's YouTube page. So I, on behalf of both the organization, thank each and everyone for making this seminar successful. And we all observe this historical day, and we all will work together to achieve our own the kind of ultimate dreams of restoration of free and independent Tibet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gompala. Thank you very much for this welcome address. And to our other friends in the audience, as we are doing it, we are thankful to you. And I promise that very soon we will be out with yet another episode of or yet another webinar on this subject, on various aspects of the Tibetan issue, and of course about China and other national, I won't say nationalities, the other countries which have been colonized like Tibet. We come up on issues related to them also. So very soon we will be with our next webinar on another issue, and we'll declare it very soon. And also, we have changed the YouTube channel. Earlier, it was going to my personal YouTube channel. Now we have, from this issue, we have started the CHASE YouTube channel, and you can watch those friends who could not join, or those friends who want to see it again, the YouTube channel of CHASE, of TYC, and the Facebook of TYC. These the entire proceedings will be available in a few minutes. So thank you very much, everybody, and see you again very soon. Namaste.
Thank you all.
Tashi Delek.
Big yellow. Big yellow, thank you.